Hi, everybody. This is Marit from Blended Family Frappé, and I am here today with my soul sisters, Christina and Genet from Radical Stepmoms Podcast. And we can see their faces. Yay. So, ladies, today we're going to talk about boundaries, which I'm really excited about because I feel like the word boundaries is something we all say, oh, boundaries, 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 but we never explain what boundaries are. And I think it would be good to just boundaries 101. And I wanted to ask you guys, because you're literal experts, mental health professionals, so you know, as professionals and as stepmoms, the importance of boundaries. So if you guys would just take a minute and maybe introduce yourselves, and then we'll talk about the good stuff.
I'm Christina from Radical Stepmoms Podcast. I've been a stepmom for 6 years. Its boundaries have, over that 6 years, have been an integral part in my happiness. Genet.
Hello, I'm Genet, co-host of Radical Stepmoms Podcast. I've been a step parent for about 4.5 years now. And just like Christina said, boundaries are something that is a continuous topic of discussion in our home and something that needs to be continuously practiced and reminded of. So it's a very important piece of our role as stepmothers, for sure.
For sure. How would each of you define what boundaries are? What would you call a boundary?
I think the analogy that I've heard that I relate to most often is that boundaries aren't you building a wall, it's more of a gate. So you get to decide what that barrier is, and you get to decide when to open it and when to close it, based upon your own comfort levels. And boundaries can change over time, and that's something that I specifically have had to explain to my partner and explain to him that, like, just because I was okay with something earlier on doesn't mean that I'm okay with it now, and just having that communication. And so it's a wall, but there's a gate there.
I love that. Do you have any, is that what you would say too, Ganat?
Perfect. I was just going to say, and we're the gatekeeper, right? So I think to add to what Christina said, which was, you said it so well, is, boundaries are what's important to you and the values that we hold and what we choose to have as acceptable in our lives, pretty much. So what's acceptable, what's comfortable for each person. And that's kind of how I identify boundaries.
I would say too, a thing that boundaries are not. I remember getting a DM from someone on Instagram who said, well, no matter how many boundaries we give my husband's ex, she still does blah, 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 blah. And I was like, that's not how boundaries work. So I think also boundaries are a thing that you do for you. They're not necessarily a rule you give to someone else, although certainly it is about how other people's behavior affects you. But I think it's really important to understand that boundaries are a thing that you create for yourself and to protect your own sanity.
Right.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the problems when you are creating a boundary, is that yes, you can try and create a boundary, but you also have to have like structured with it. So you have to be consistent in upholding that boundary, and you also have to have known consequences in place for when that boundary is crossed. And I think that is where people kind of get confused or lost in it, in that they're attempting to have boundaries and they know what they are, but they don't really know what happens when someone doesn't follow them or doesn't respect them. And then that is how you maintain them.
So that was actually, I'm sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
I was going to say that's like a lot of the DMs that I get is like, yeah, I'm trying to do this. And then I said, and I usually respond with, well, what's the consequence? What have you established? And then they're like, oh, like, yeah, okay, so let's talk about that.
That was actually exactly what got me thinking about this workshop. Was you put in your stories on Instagram a cute little, here's what a boundary is, and got to the part about consequences. And I was like, oh, that makes so much sense. And I would have thought I was pretty good at boundaries, but I did not have that recipe down. Do you remember? So, do you remember what that formula was? It was something like, it was like a 3-step or 4-step
Yeah,
boundary
so
setting.
like Gannett had mentioned, your boundaries are really formed based upon your core beliefs and your values. So first identifying where that comes from. And so, for example, if, I value manners and being polite, and then then you have a situation where a kid, this is very, very tiny example, but like if you have a kid that's being very disrespectful and not saying please and thank you and not being appreciative, then that is pulling at you in some way because of those core values and those beliefs, maybe because of how you were raised or because of how you want to raise your children, whatever that is. And so once that is first identified, then you can really have more reasoning for it. And when you explain it to someone, when you're having that communication piece, discussing your boundaries, you're able to have that as, an explanation. So the first step is identifying what you value and what you believe and why this is upsetting to you, and then communicating it in a way that is respectful to the other person, but also, establishing this is how I feel and this is why I feel it. This is what I'm needing. And then having some sort of consequence to it and communicating what that consequence is. And that's like the biggest end piece to it, is communicating, because if the person that you're trying to establish a boundary with isn't aware of the consequence, then what can they expect, or what are they really trying to work on? And the consequences piece could be as simple as, I don't want you to talk to me like that. If you talk to me like that, I'm going to walk away. Or I'm not going to engage in the conversation any longer until you can speak to me nicely, or whatever that may be. So was that what you're talking, those three kind of?
Yeah, perfect. That was exactly it.
Yeah.
And just to add to what Christina's saying, which was right on. I mean, I think in addition to that is, in order to know your boundaries, you should know yourself, and that takes some self-reflection, right? So again, looking at your core values, where do those come from? Is it cultural based? Is it your upbringing? Is it family, just your surroundings, just anything that was influential for you, from early on until now. And then that piece about consistency that Christina spoke about. And if you're having difficulties with that, looking at why aren't I consistent with my boundaries? Is it because I want to please someone? Is it because I want to be liked or loved? Is it because I'm the helper? Is it because I want to accommodate? Is it just because I don't fully understand? And maybe that takes some time to explore that, so that you can understand why these boundaries are important to you, and that will help you practice them better, and again communicate them with whomever that is.
I love that idea of basing boundaries in your values, because that again makes absolute sense, but dots that I did not connect. And so, to use your example of manners, Dan and I were just talking about this yesterday, where I was because we still talk about things that happened 10 years ago, and I was saying, if I went back in time, there's no way I would put up with X, Y, and Z now. And then I kind of thought about it, and I thought, yeah, but even at the time, it was a situation where, as an example, my stepdaughter would come into the house and not acknowledge me, wouldn't say hi, wouldn't say good morning in the morning, wouldn't. I said, but even at the time, I remember thinking, is it just that she has no manners? Because that is a real possibility, because I know that there are a lot of places where her manners are not they're not how I would raise my kid. They're not manners that I would instill, or lacking manners that I definitely would require. And so I really wasn't sure, is she actually being disrespectful, or is it just that she doesn't know? But knowing what I know now, I mean, that is a boundary that I would set of, hey, this is a normal expectation of humans when they enter into a home that they share with other humans.
Yeah.
These are manners that we have in society. And, and then but I can't think off the top of my head of a good consequence for that. But it would be good, I guess, if you don't, I will remind you every time.
Yeah, yeah,
You know?
absolutely. And not only, I mean, just also bringing in how you feel about it and adding
Right,
some humanity there and explaining like it hurts my feelings when you walk
right,
into the room and you don't say hi to me. Like I want to say hi to you, I want to engage with you, and when you do that, it makes me feel like this. Adding those feeling words, and especially to, I mean, because that particular conversation or conversations that I have with my stepson all the time, because he doesn't really understand social norms. He doesn't understand basic social skills about making eye contact, or how you respond when someone gets hurt, or things like that, where I have to explain to him like, buddy, when this happens and you don't respond a certain way, it can hurt my feelings. And
um,
I think that consequence would probably work, and consequences that I've had to use, I've had to get really creative with my stepson specifically, because he doesn't always care about what the consequences are. So
right,
that's the other thing. If a consequence doesn't seem to work, you got to be flexible and try to figure something else out that would get the point across.
right. That's one thing my parents did really well raising us. We're not divorced, but they're very good about the consequences fitting whatever the action was, and letting, not necessarily having a like a punishment, but having, okay, well, if you went behind our back and watched a TV show you weren't supposed to watch or whatever, then you're grounded from TV for a week because you've lost that privilege. It was a very good explanation of everything you have is a privilege that can be taken away.
Yep.
Which, sorry, that was a total tangent, but
Yeah.
Anywho, I feel like boundaries 101 are also related to parenting 101.
Oh yeah.
And it's the basic, these are my expectations, here's why I have the expectations, and here why they're important to me, and if they're not met, this is what will happen. I think is a part of, it's really a part of parenting, and especially if you're parenting with someone who already has kids, you're parenting their kids.
Yeah, and to add to I guess understand your core values and beliefs, but when you're communicating that to whoever you're trying to establish a boundary with, to have it be a conversation. And I think that is what can be intimidating when you're trying to have this conversation with someone, because it can feel like the other person might get defensive, or that like you're creating a boundary because obviously it needs to be there. And so the person there will be resistance. So to understand that going into that conversation, and knowing what you will and will not tolerate, and being comfortable in asking for what you need, but also understanding that there might be some compromise in the mix as well.
Yeah.
Because you're coming to whoever you're talking, I guess specifically with like your partner or your family member or a friend or mom or whoever, that you care about that person, and they have boundaries and core values and beliefs as well. So I think just to make that note that it's a conversation, and there's dialogue and discussion, and it's not something that happens overnight necessarily.
Yeah.
But to go into that conversation knowing what you will and will not tolerate, and where you do have room for compromise, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally.
Absolutely. And just to add to that, I think in communicating with your partner, having different boundaries and reasons for those boundaries, I think recognizing that feeling guilty can be a natural part of it, right? And just, especially in the step parent role, for me, I struggle sometimes because I have certain boundaries that I want to continuously, practice, but my partner, my husband, feels differently, and he should, and that's okay. And it's going back to exactly what Christina said, is how do we compromise? Because there are things that he's a lot more comfortable with when it comes to the kiddo versus myself. And so when you take a look at that, it's, not to create conflict around it, though it can go there, right? If you're not feeling heard, but just trying to come to that place of understanding and not feeling bad. And it does take time. In the beginning, there was that feeling of guilt, and am I being too rigid? Are these boundaries unfair? but they're not, as long as you feel comfortable with them. And that's what I had to continuously remind myself is I'm better. I'm taking care of myself, right? Boundaries equals self-care in a lot of ways, right? So it just had to let go of that guilt, and try to leave room for more understanding. And then again, that compromise, overall compromise.
Yeah, another aspect of guilt too, thinking again about manners and my example of my stepdaughter not really greeting me at the house, I really struggled with, well, do I talk to her when I know she's already uncomfortable and already because we'd been together for, like 4 years by the time we got married. And so it wasn't like we were new to each other. So I really struggled with, well, if I have this conversation with, well, listen, it's, it's hurtful and it's whatever, is that one more pressure that I'm adding to increase conflict between the two of us, or am I pressuring her too much by putting, I really struggled with what is the right answer. And ultimately I decided the right answer is to suck it up, which is not what I would do now. But in the moment it seemed like, well, I better to just keep my mouth shut and not rock the boat. And what kind of advice would you have? I think that guilt and that stepmom guilt is just insidious. What kind of advice would you have to overcome guilt and other obstacles that we run into when we're trying to set boundaries? You sighed like, so I have so much advice.
No, it's like the guilt, I think, comes with everything.
Yeah.
And I think personally, I just remind myself, like, I literally can't carry this with me all the time. Like, I just can't. And I know that when I am doing things like creating boundaries, I am ultimately giving to myself so I can be a better person to other people, to my family, to my husband, to, my stepkid and my daughter. Like, everyone is going to reap the benefits of me
Right.
being a happier person. And understanding that people will react to the boundaries that you create, and to keep that open dialogue and have discussions, and to ask the other person, depending upon the situation, of like, how does this affect you? How does this impact you? How can we come to a place where we can both find this happy, comfortable area? Because, like, for your example with your stepdaughter, did you ever ask her, like, is there a reason why you don't say hi to me when you come in, or is there a reason? Did you?
No,
Yeah.
we never had that conversation. And I talked to Dan about it about 1,000,000 times, and he was too cruxed out to do anything about it. And we were dealing with a lot of shit, and that was just, honestly, that was just not even close to the major things that we were dealing with. So I just it was just one more shitty thing. Yeah.
You gotta pick your battles. I think
Right.
one of the things that, like, advice I try and give is, one, try not to take so many things personally, especially when the kids get older, because teenage angst and stuff. And
Right.
I'm just terrified of that.
Right.
Happening. He's 9 and he's already so mad all the time. But to not take things personally, but to also inquire when you do take things personally, and to use those I statements, and to say, I'm feeling like you're kind of standoffish, or I'm feeling like you're, upset with me, or that is there's anything that you'd like to talk about? Like, just keeping that dialogue and that communication open. That, to me, when I have had multiple conversations and communicate and all that stuff, coming to a boundary and establishing, I have more information where I don't feel so guilty, because then it feels like a necessity. Like, if this is going to continue and this is not providing happiness for me, then it has to, and guilt can't be a part of it, because it's just not an option.
Yeah, I love that.
Definitely.
I love too that. Sorry, Jeanette, were you gonna say something?
I was just going to add to what Christina's saying about, guilt is hard. And for me, I had to learn the hard way, right? And I just went in and did everything. And then I became burnt out. I was burnt
Right.
out, and I was no good to myself, and I was no good to my family. And it took a couple of those, scenarios for me to check in, do a personal inventory and say, what's going on here? I'm driven by this guilt, this obligation to make everyone happy, to be the helper, to do what I need to do within my roles as a spouse and as a stepmother, but I've forgotten about myself. And so at that point, then you're just no good, at that point, because, I found myself shutting down and just being overwhelmed and still trying to drive, you know, drive the vehicle and do everything involved with all parts of our journey. And it took a while. So my advice would be just to listen to yourself. And that's what I wasn't doing, is I wasn't listening to myself, and I was allowing so many things to take over, and until I found myself not feeling the way that I should be, which was, overwhelmed, burnt out. And just, again, doing that personal inventory and saying, what do I need? And at that point, things change. As long as you keep it up, of course.
Right. Well, two things. First of all, if you know from the beginning that communication is really important and you start there and you keep the lines of communication open, that's a way different scenario than, I think, like me and maybe Genet too, it sounds like, where we were in it for a while and then we're like, well, this isn't working, and now I have to start these hard conversations that are so much harder to start because there's all this weight behind them now, where we're way past the getting to know you stage. Now our minds are made up stage, and it makes it really hard to, it feels a lot more vulnerable, I think, being, having those, they shouldn't feel like emotional conversations. I mean, they're basic conversations, but it just feels like there's so much riding on it. And then the other thing I was going to say is, Genet, I'm so glad you said that, because you're a literal mental health professional and know all of this stuff and know about, I mean, everything on paper. I mean, you have training and still got like so in your head about this role that it just like, it's just crazy to me how it flips us upside down.
Right. When you're in it, sometimes
Yeah.
that clinical expertise, or, just the trainings that we've had and the textbook information that we've learned throughout the years, it goes out the window because there's more involved now, right? There's emotion there. It's your family. And what were you going to say, Christina?
I was just going to say that I think Genet and I both have this internal drive to help people. Like, that's why we are in the profession that we're in.
Right.
So when we got into these relationships, it was like, wow, like, it wasn't like we had our cape on and we were going to go save the relationship or save the family dynamic or whatever. But it was, we fell in love with the man and they had kids, and we knew that we could be assistants. Speaking for myself, like, there was a lot of things that I knew because of my profession on how my stepson could have better supports and resources and stuff. And so I was very much in that mindset. I was actually on overdrive being a social worker
Sure.
and not really paying attention to what I need to do for myself, and that I'm actually personally involved in this. And then that's when I had to backpedal and be like, this isn't actually working for me.
Yep. I agree.
Yeah, I recognized a lot of, I have longstanding anxiety issues, and I recognized a lot of anxiety issues in my stepdaughter also, not diagnosed, and no one was talking about them. This is really, really hard for me to not say, hey, these things are contributing to her anxiety. And I mean, I did say that and try to step in, but I for sure got, just way overly emotionally involved in trying to save her from this situation. I could not save her from. There's no way that I could have.
Yeah.
And
Did you
I
guys?
love that you say
Go
that,
ahead.
Mara, because, sorry, just to add to what you said about saving her, and that's the exact mentality that I had when I entered, this relationship, and then learning more about what was going on for my stepdaughter. I found it it was up to me. It was up to me to save her from this because of my background and my profession.
Yeah,
And
like you have a professional responsibility to help this
yes,
kid, right?
absolutely. I
Ah,
must save her. I'm hearing these stories. I'm hearing, this information. It doesn't sit right. What would I do? I'm a mandated reporter, just taking on
right.
all of these roles. And it's like, okay, if you take a step back from that, she's my kid now,
Yeah.
and so things are a lot different. So, yeah, you just reminded me about using that word saving, right? And it's
Yeah, I wouldn't have thought that I was a rescuer kind of person. I'm really not a rescuer type of personality. It was more that I saw that there were inefficient parts of our system that could be working a lot better. And
yes.
it was like, well, if we fix these problems, then these things will work better. But it turned out that, and this is something I would love to talk about for a minute, is I say all the time on Instagram that when you're dealing with someone who's high conflict, the answer isn't more compromise, it's better boundaries.
Sure.
And one of the reasons I say that is because when you are dealing with someone who's high conflict, you keep expecting them to meet you halfway. And before you know it, you have gone so far beyond your own what sits right ethically and morally with you. You've gone so far past that everything feels horrible. And so I think with a high conflict person, you need to stay over here because they're always going to be over here. They're never going to come closer to you. And so I think with a boundary, you need to decide, well, how far am I going to come on this issue? And then I will go that far and no further, even if they never come closer to you.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah.
and you guys are both in high conflict situations.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah, we are.
Oh yeah. I think it's hard because like I talked about recently, that when you have a high conflict situation, I still have like the little bit of hope that things are going to be
Totally.
better, or that things are going to lead
Yep.
to respect and
Yeah,
mutual,
always.
all that stuff. And that is when I find myself crossing my own boundary, thinking that, I'm trying to keep that gate open. I'm trying to keep, room for improvement or room for change. And then sure enough, I have to smack it shut and put up the padlocks because shit went crazy. But
Right. Every time.
every time. Yeah. But yeah, when it comes to high conflict stuff, there really can't be compromise, because you give them an inch, they'll want a mile. And they'll not understand if it was done this way one time, why it can't be done another. Like, you just have to remain
Yep.
as strict as possible, or it's worthless. Boundaries
Yeah.
are worthless.
Can you explain, we always, I think all three of us talk about boundaries in a way that it protects us, but can you explain why that is? Is it because I feel like if we don't have good boundaries, then we're taking actions that kind of undermine what makes us tick, and which ends up over time just kind of eroding away our, I don't know what it's eroding, something important that it's not good to chip away at.
Yeah, I mean, going back to the core values and beliefs, if it's affecting
Right.
you a certain way and it's upsetting you and it's making you uncomfortable, or it's making you angry, or it's just evoking all these negative emotions, that's when you do the internal digging and figure out, okay, why exactly is this bothering me? It's bothering me because it's important to me. If it's important to me, why is it important to me? What exactly? And I've sent out to some listeners, and I have a core values and beliefs inventory. You can get them online and you can find them, but essentially it's, you find out what is most important to you. Is it money? Is it feeling loved? Is it feeling secure? Is it like is it appreciation? Like, what exactly? And then once you kind of know that about yourself, you can see, oh, well, that's why it's bugging me so much, because this is inside of me. This is who I am. This is what makes me me. And when that's constantly being threatened, there will be the reaction. And in some cases it's like, things happen and I'm like, yeah, that doesn't really bug me and I can let it go. And then something really bugs me and my husband's like, what is that? And I'm like, well, that's pulling at my appreciation piece. That's pulling at my need to feel appreciated and all that stuff. So that, and then it's easier to communicate that. But to answer your question, I think that it goes back to that core value and belief. And if things keep happening and making you upset, then it's asking those questions as why is this upsetting me?
I love that.
Mm-hmm. I'd agree.
Well, I guess, would you be willing to share a couple personal examples of a boundary that you didn't have at the beginning of this journey and have in place now, and some of the benefits that boundary has had? And I'll go too. We'll do a round robin.
Okay. Genet, you go.
I can start. I think in the beginning, I my husband was okay with the kiddo coming in to sleep in the bed, and typically it wouldn't be, every night, but it would be often, whether it be in the middle of the night or coming in the morning, etc. And for a little bit there, for a while, I was putting up with it. I was just tolerating it, for lack of a better term, because that's what they had gotten used to, and I was the newcomer. And slowly I realized that, I'm not comfortable with this. I'm not comfortable with this child sleeping in my bed, the bed that I share with my spouse. And it took literally over a year for my husband to finally get on board. And in between that year, there were many conversations, a few arguments, and just me having to remind him of what was important to me and what was comfortable for me. Most importantly, what was comfortable for me.
Mm-hmm.
I know the idea that a child sleeping in your bed, for some may be a big deal, for some it's not. For me, I don't have a child of my own, so I'm unfamiliar with that.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, I have a lot of nieces and nephews, and you put them down for a nap, you might sleep with a child for, a little bit of time. But it was different, it was different. Yep. And it was consistent, and it was invading a space of mine, of ours, that I was not comfortable with, and I couldn't get used to it. I gave it a try, and then it took I gave it the good effort, and then I had to tap into myself and say, I'm not okay with this. I don't feel comfortable. Yeah. This isn't something that I adore, or that I just can't, I can live without, and so it was a difficult situation, because he was comfortable with the kiddo coming in if she had a dream, or if it was just habit forming, honestly. And I had to slowly implement ideas. Hey, do you want to come in if you had a bad dream? Knock, or, knock in the morning, or whatever, just so that we could pace ourselves and slowly kind of unravel something that I wasn't so clear about in the beginning. And that was, I don't want a child sleeping in the bed. Now, it's hard, because I think about, well, one day if I do have my own child, will that change? I'm not sure. And it probably will. And it will. And that will be a boundary of mine that is changing again. I'm not quite sure, but that's probably been our biggest battle for a while. And that's not been happening for a while now. And it's great. But
I love it.
Hard, and I felt bad, because you feel bad. You feel bad for him. You feel bad for the kiddo. You don't want them to see. You don't want to have them feel rejected, or just not loved, or not. Why doesn't she want to cuddle with me? I'm all for the cuddles, but the bed is my sanctuary. That's our space, and so that's where I draw the line. And so that.
Genet, what would you say what you've identified as your core values or beliefs attached to that boundary?
I just think about how I was raised and my upbringing. We didn't sleep in the bed with our parents. That was just something we didn't do. Of course, we can go in the room and hang out with them, and I would go and talk with my mom and sit on the edge of their bed. But I didn't lay with my parents all night, or at night or come in the middle of the night. It just wasn't something that I was used to, and that I experienced myself. So that's, thinking about it. And my husband was the opposite. His family was open. His brothers, they would just all climb in the bed, and it would be a big old slumber party. And so I had to really get him to talk about that so I can understand, look, at our upbringings look completely different. One is not right or wrong. And how do we come to that compromise? Because I don't want to be uncomfortable in my bed as an adult woman.
Right.
So, and that's where I had to really, check in with myself and say, this is not okay. Enough about how they're feeling. I have to, tap into how I'm feeling. So I guess it's just the idea that wasn't familiar to me. Now, again, we'll see how things evolve in the future, but for now, I like it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I like that. Do you want to go, Christina? Should I go?
Sure.
I'll go. Oh, no. Go ahead and go. I was going to say, I'll go and you can ask me the core values question because I don't know the answer. Maybe we'll find out together. So my example is a boundary with the ex, actually, and not my stepdaughter, which is that I was super involved. I'm the organizer of the family. So I managed the family calendar, which of course didn't exist before me. And because I needed to know, well, when are my stepdaughter's activities? When are these functions? And especially when we lived, well, also when we moved in together, but especially when we still live separately and we're dating, and I had to coordinate with my own kids' schedule and her activities, and then driving across town and, whatever had to happen. So I just let my stepdaughter's mom know, hey, shoot me an email. Let me know if, because she went to a private school that was really disorganized and touchy-feely, and they just were not, they would give out information that changed. They would only give it out some of the time. They weren't clear about when things were due or when events were really happening. And so there really wasn't ever good communication that I could get outside of Biomom. So I said, hey, just let me know when stuff is coming, because it was a major sore spot between houses that my husband Dan, would just get my stepdaughter places late or forget about these events. And it was just this ongoing drama. So I was like, I can fix this. It doesn't need to be a disaster. Biomom, tell me, I will make sure stepdaughter gets there. It is no problem. And I'm happy to do it. And I was happy to do it because it was a way that I could contribute. But what it ended up happening is that it led to these crazy passive aggressive emails among the three of us. And then later when Biomom started dating a guy seriously among all four of us about, well, I don't know why Marit, blah, 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 but it's an email addressed to Dan from Biomom. And I finally had, so the boundary that I drew was finally like, okay, I'm not going to help then. And I just had to take myself out of the loop because it was making me crazy. It just made me crazy. I could not get a straight answer. And now in hindsight, again, of course, that is part of that. Don't compromise with someone who's high conflict, because her goal was not for my stepdaughter to actually get to those places on time. She just wanted to be angry. And if we got her everywhere on time, she would have found something else to be angry about, So
Yeah.
that's my boundary story.
So what was your core value or belief there? I have a guess, but what do you?
I was going to say, I have a guess too.
I feel like I'm in the hot seat because you guys are both big professionals. I feel like, I think probably a core value of mine is that if I'm capable of making things better, then I should be doing that. Okay, now tell me.
I feel like
tell me the right answer.
Like the bigger picture. I feel like a core value to you is being on time.
Yep.
And communication and being reliable.
Yeah.
I like all of that was triggering for you because you don't want her to be late to things, and you want her to be a reliable human being and to show up when you're supposed to. And you're upset with the school because they weren't even communicating those things. So how can you so core value is being reliable, and in being reliable you're on time and all that stuff. So because bio mom was not also feeling that wasn't important to her, you felt, well, I can help this, I can fix it. And they probably didn't see that there was a problem because
She did. I mean, that was an issue for her. And so I would say on paper, absolutely she thought that
she
my
didn't want
stepdaughter
you involved in it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Mhm.
She would rather be mad at Dan for failing than actually have my stepdaughter
Problem.
get there on time. Yeah.
So if you could go back, what would you do differently?
I wouldn't have offered to help in the first place is the main thing I would do differently. And then also I think I would disengage. I would just not, why am I hanging my emotional hat on whether my stepdaughter makes it to her fundraising car wash on time? That's not my responsibility. And if Dan wants to not get yelled at, then he is a grown-ass man who is fully capable of keeping his eye on the clock and getting his daughter in the car and getting her there on time. I don't need to manage that. So that's how I would handle it. Bye, have fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Christina.
I'm trying to think. I'm trying to think of one that I want to use. I mean, there's many, but
there's so many.
I think what I'll use is, so I got into the habit of being in charge of doing like the bedtime routine with my stepson. And so I got distracted. There's a bird down there.
Is it a pretty bird though?
It's a pretty bird, yeah. I got into the habit of being in charge of bedtime and tucking him in and doing that whole thing. And every single night, most recently, it's led to my stepson pretty much just complaining about, because we're the non-preferred house, and so it was just him really chatting with me about all his questions about our blended family at this point. So he's asking me questions about why his mom can't come live with us. He's asking me questions about why we're not all one big happy family, and why he can't have his mom over for dinner, and why his mom isn't married. Like all these questions that he doesn't ask his father. And it's like, okay. Oh, and then in addition to that, he wanted to cuddle with me every night because that's what he and his mom does. And similar to Genet, it's just not a physical thing that I feel very comfortable with. He's a 9-year-old boy, and I struggle in him trying to put me into the mom role, like to not, like, he sees me as mom, but he's literally trying to have me do all the things that his mom does. And I don't want to do that if it makes me uncomfortable. Sure, I will get him the same toothpaste that she gets him. Sure, I will, do certain things to make him feel comfortable in our home because I know that that's something that his mom does. But when it comes to my own personal feelings, so the boundary was having a conversation with my husband and being like, hey, this is something that I think you should be providing him as his father, and that I don't necessarily.
The whole bedtime routine, or just those questions? The whole thing.
The whole bedtime, yeah, because it was just it was very emotionally taxing on me every single night, and it was to the point where he'd be like, "No, I don't want you, Dad. I want Mom." And it's like I sometimes need to step back so my husband can be involved and be the parent, and it's not just me and his mom raising him, that you have a dad too, and he's in this house and he can answer these questions for you. And it was also causing conflict between my husband and I, because I would come upstairs and be like, oh, this is another conversation we've had, and why do I have to be the one to answer all these questions? And I felt like I shouldn't be answering the questions of why you and your ex aren't together anymore. Like, that shouldn't be on me.
Right.
That's on you. Yeah.
Yeah. So it was more of a boundary that I was creating with my husband and asking him, hey, this is a parenting routine that I would like you to take on. My core values really are, it's a good question. What would that core value be? I think I was feeling underappreciated in the amount of emotional drainage that was having, and I didn't feel like my husband was really appreciating that I was continuously doing that. And then it was like, all right, this is on you now, because I need space. And explaining the X factor over and over again, I don't want to do that anymore.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, right? Yeah, super comfortable. I'm sorry your mom can't come over. We just don't like her.
Yeah, there's just no good way to say that.
No. Yeah, and I've talked a lot about how all those different conversations with him, but it's like it's just not my place. Like I don't want to be the one always having that, so I had to speak up.
Yeah, I love that.
In all fairness, it's their story to tell too, right?
Yeah,
So,
yeah, totally.
Yeah. And
in a
lot of ways, he feels comfortable talking to me about these things, so that's great. But and I would be happy to answer them in a different setting. But the whole bedtime routine, it was just taking so long, and it was just like, no, your dad can put you to sleep now. Like, your dad can do the cuddles and all that stuff. Like, we're good.
Yeah, I love that. Anything else you can think of to add about boundaries? I feel like we covered so much. This is all. I wish I would have. Yet one more thing. I wish I would have known 10 years ago.
I think the one last thing I would add is just once you have a hold of, and this may never be the case because you have to revisit it, right? Because like Christina said earlier, your boundaries change or can change. But once you have a good grip on them or an understanding, and you're able to communicate that with whether it be your partner, your stepchild, or whomever, it's such a freeing feeling. And that's what I'll say. That's my takeaway from, the boundaries that I have, had to deal with throughout my journey as a stepmother. It's freeing once you get to that point, and maybe that's letting that guilt has been let go of to some degree or all the way. I'm not quite sure for each person, but it's such a good, freeing feeling. And I feel like I'm still working on some boundary pieces in my family unit, but I've gotten. I'm a lot further than I was, and you're a work in progress. And so I think it's just good. It's a good feeling. So
I think my dad, when I was growing up, would always say to me, you decide how people treat you. And that has stuck with me. And it's, if you don't like how you're being treated, if you don't like how you're feeling, if you don't like, if it's something's just sitting with you, like, you decide how people treat you, you create the rules, you can establish that boundary and teach them the appropriate way or the way that best fits you, so you can be happier. Like, if you allow it to continue, it will continue. And that's exactly what a boundary is intended to do, is no longer allow you to be mistreated.
I love that. I had a boss of mine. His thing he would always say is, you always have an abundance of what you tolerate.
Yep.
I like that.
All right. Well, you guys, I cannot thank you enough for being here and sharing all your wisdom, and all the wisdom you share on your podcast too. You ladies, I'm so glad that you exist and that you talk the real talk for the other stepmoms out there. You were talking, Christina and Genet, you guys were talking about doing some small group help with boundaries. If people want one-on-one help in little groups of like 4 or 6. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so probably next month or so, we're going to release some slots for a couple different Zoom workshops, and they'll be tailored to different topics. So if you have boundaries that you want to talk about, or go through those steps and figure out how exactly to implement them into your life, then sign up for those specific workshops, and we will spend our time going. And the benefit of that is there's multiple people that we can talk with and learn from, and work on the different things together. So
Yeah, honestly, even a decade after the calendar fiasco, just hearing like, oh yeah, well, being on time is important to you, that's why it bugged you. Like, oh yeah, that shouldn't be so eye-opening, and yet it really was. So
yeah.
All right, perfect. Well, I will tell folks, and then folks can sign up for that through your site.
Yeah, I will do emails and Instagram stories. There'll be things are open now, and
all right, perfect. All
Cool.
right, maybe I'll pop in and crash like I did, like I crashed that one time.
Please do.
Love it.
All right,
So
ladies.
awesome.
Oh my God, these serious question. Do these fit anyone's ears? These
No.
They're crazy. Anyway, thank you for all the talk on boundaries. You guys are the best, and I'll see you. I'll see you on your podcast, and I'll see you on Instagram.
Cool. Thank you.
Thanks, ladies. Bye.
Bye.